Ladies and gentlemen, the principle of act as if is not about pretending or escaping reality. It is a practical and educational method of training the mind to align with a desired outcome. Human experience consistently shows that what we assume to be true internally eventually expresses itself externally. The idea of act as if begins with understanding what the phrase truly means, because it is often misunderstood as imagination, false hope, or superficial confidence. In reality, it is a disciplined mental and emotional practice grounded in how human perception and behavior operate. To act as if is not to deny current circumstances, nor is it to lie to oneself. It is the deliberate choice to assume a particular inner position before external evidence appears. Every individual lives from assumptions, whether consciously or unconsciously. An assumption is simply something accepted as true without constant questioning. These assumptions shape how a person interprets events, reacts to situations, and makes decisions. When someone assumes they are capable, their behavior reflects confidence. When someone assumes they are limited, their actions unconsciously confirm that belief. Acting as if is the intentional selection of an empowering assumption and living from it. From an educational standpoint, the mind learns through experience. It does not distinguish sharply between what is vividly imagined and what is physically experienced. Repeated mental exposure creates familiarity, and familiarity creates belief. When a person consistently assumes the feeling of having already achieved a goal, the mind begins to treat that state as normal. This normalization is essential because people do not struggle for what feels natural to them, they simply live it. Acting as if does not mean forcing behavior that feels unnatural. It begins internally. The first level of acting as if is internal alignment, thinking from the desired position rather than about it. For example, instead of asking how something will happen, the individual shifts to asking what the next natural step would be if it were already true. This subtle change redirects attention from lack to possession, from waiting to participating. Emotion plays a crucial role in this process. Thoughts alone are not enough. They must be accompanied by the feeling that matches the assumed state. Feeling is the language through which the deeper mind accepts ideas. When someone acts as if they are already successful, calm, or fulfilled, they cultivate the emotional atmosphere associated with that state. Over time, the mind accepts this emotional pattern as identity rather than aspiration. This practice also reshapes perception. Two people can experience the same external situation, but interpret it completely differently based on their assumptions. One sees obstacles, the other sees feedback. Acting as if changes what the mind notices. Opportunities that were previously ignored become visible, not because they suddenly appeared, but because the individual's internal lens has changed. Another important educational aspect of acting as if is behavioral alignment. Behavior naturally follows belief. When an assumption is accepted internally, actions shift without force. A person who assumes competence prepares differently, communicates differently, and persists differently. These behaviors are not conscious efforts to prove worth. They are natural expressions of an assumed identity. Time is often misunderstood in this process. Acting as if does not promise instant results, but it guarantees internal consistency. The moment the assumption is adopted, the inner conflict between desire and identity dissolves. This internal harmony reduces resistance, anxiety, and doubt. With reduced inner friction, actions become clearer and more effective. Many abandon this principle because they expect immediate physical confirmation. However, education teaches that mastery precedes recognition. A student practices before passing the exam, understanding develops before grades reflect it. Similarly, acting as if is the practice phase of creation. It is where internal mastery is developed before external validation appears. It is also essential to understand that acting as if does not require dramatic changes. Small, consistent shifts in self-talk, expectation, and response are sufficient. The mind responds more effectively to repetition than intensity. Quiet consistency is more powerful than emotional extremes. Each moment of alignment reinforces the assumption, strengthening it over time. Acting as if is ultimately about identity. People do not get what they want, they experience what aligns with who they believe they are. When identity shifts, results follow naturally. This is why the practice focuses on being rather than becoming. The individual stops seeing the desired state as future and begins experiencing it as present in consciousness. In educational terms, this principle teaches responsibility. It places the source of change within the individual rather than in external conditions. This is not a burden, but an empowerment. When one understands that assumptions are learned and therefore changeable, personal transformation becomes practical rather than mystical, acting as if also trains emotional resilience. When challenges arise, the assumed state acts as an anchor. Instead of reacting impulsively, the individual responds from a position of stability. This does not eliminate difficulty, but it changes the relationship with it. Problems become temporary conditions rather than permanent definitions. Over time, the repetition of acting as if buoy, LDS self-trust. The individual learns that inner discipline leads to tangible change. This trust reduces the need for constant reassurance and external approval. Confidence becomes internal rather than dependent on circumstances. The meaning of act as if is the conscious decision to live from a chosen assumption rather than from habitual limitation. It is the educational process of training the mind to accept a new normal. When the mind accepts it, behavior follows, perception shifts, and outcomes adjust accordingly. What once felt like imagination becomes experience, not through force, but through alignment. This principle is not a shortcut, nor is it a fantasy. It is a method of inner education, teaching the mind how to relate to possibility as reality through consistent practice. Acting as if transforms from an exercise into a way of living, where intention and experience move in the same direction. The role of assumption is central to understanding how human experience is formed, because assumption operates quietly beneath conscious thought, yet directs nearly every outcome a person encounters. An assumption is not merely a hopeful idea or a passing belief, it is a settled inner conclusion about how life works, who one is, and what is possible. Once an assumption is accepted internally, the mind stops questioning it and begins organizing perception, emotion, and behavior around it. From an educational perspective, assumptions function like internal rules. Just as physical laws govern the material world, assumptions govern personal experience. A person who assumes effort always leads to exhaustion will unconsciously resist opportunities. Another who assumes learning is enjoyable will approach challenges with curiosity rather than fear. In both cases, the assumption shapes results without the individual being fully aware of its influence. Assumptions are formed through a repetition, emotional experiences, social conditioning, and past outcomes. Many are adopted early in life and carried forward without examination. Because they feel familiar, they appear true. The mind often mistakes familiarity for fact. This is why people may continue experiencing the same patterns even when they consciously desire change. Desire alone does not override assumption. Assumption overrides desire. The subconscious mind accepts assumptions as instructions. It does not evaluate whether an assumption is beneficial or harmful. It simply acts to confirm it. This is why two people with equal skills and opportunities can experience vastly different results. Their inner assumptions guide attention, decision-making, and persistence in subtle but powerful ways. What one expects to happen feels normal, and the mind naturally moves toward what feels normal. Assumption also shapes emotional responses. When an individual assumes success is uncertain, anxiety becomes the default emotional state. When an individual assumes stability, calm becomes natural even during uncertainty. Emotions are not random reactions, they are responses aligned with underlying assumptions. By observing emotional patterns, one can often identify the assumptions operating beneath them. Educational psychology shows that learners perform according to expectations placed upon them, especially expectations they accept internally. This principle applies broadly to life. When a person assumes improvement is possible, effort feels meaningful. When a person assumes outcomes are fixed, effort feels pointless. In this way, assumption determines not only results, but also motivation itself. Changing assumptions is not about arguing with the mind or forcing positive statements. The mind resists ideas that conflict sharply with what it already accepts. Effective assumption change occurs gradually through experience, repetition, and emotional familiarity. When a new assumption is gently introduced and consistently reinforced, it begins to feel less foreign and more believable. Acting as if plays a critical role here because behavior provides experiential evidence to the mind. When a person behaves in alignment with a chosen assumption, even in small ways, the mind receives confirmation. For example, acting with self-respect reinforces the assumption of worth. Acting with patience reinforces the assumption of control. Over time, these behaviors stop feeling deliberate and start feeling natural, which indicates that the assumption has been accepted. Another important aspect of assumption is selectivity. The mind filters reality based on what it assumes to be important or relevant. Opportunities, information, and connections that align with an assumption are noticed, while those that do not are overlooked. This selective perception explains why change often appears sudden from the outside, even though it was preceded by an internal shift. Assumptions also influence interpretation of setbacks. A person who assumes growth interprets mistakes as feedback. A person who assumes inadequacy interprets the same mistakes as proof of failure. The external event remains the same, but the internal meaning assigned to it differs. Meaning determines emotional response, and emotional response determines future behavior. In educational development, mastery is built by assuming the role of a learner rather than a failure. Students who assume confusion is part of learning persist longer and achieve more. This same principle applies to life goals. When an individual assumes challenges are temporary and solvable, persistence becomes easier. The assumption acts as a stabilizing framework. One of the most overlooked roles of assumption is identity formation. Identity is a collection of assumptions a person holds about themselves. Statements such as, "I am not good at this," or "this is just how I am," are assumptions presented as facts. Once integrated into identity, they shape every related experience. Changing results, therefore, requires questioning identity-based assumptions and replacing them with more expansive ones. Assumptions are reinforced through language, both internal and external. Self-talk reflects and strengthens assumptions. Repeated phrases become mental shortcuts the mind uses to interpret situations. By becoming aware of habitual language patterns, an individual gains insight into their underlying assumptions. Adjusting language is one practical method of reshaping them. Assumption does not eliminate effort, it directs effort efficiently. When a person assumes success is possible, effort is applied with purpose. When a person assumes failure is likely, effort becomes inconsistent or half-hearted. The difference lies not in ability but in expectation. Assumption also affects timing perception. Those who assume things take too long experience impatience and frustration. Those who assume progress is unfolding experience patience and consistency. Time itself does not change, but the relationship with time does. This emotional relationship influences whether a person continues or abandons a process. Over time, lived experience reinforces assumption in a feedback loop. Assumptions influence behavior, behavior influences outcomes, and outcomes reinforce assumptions. Breaking this loop requires conscious interruption at the assumption level. This is why internal change must precede lasting external change. The role of assumption is foundational. It is the unseen structure supporting every visible result. Education teaches that understanding fundamentals leads to mastery. In the same way, understanding and consciously selecting assumptions leads to deliberate creation rather than unconscious repetition. When an individual learns to observe, question, and see whose assumptions intentionally, life shifts from reaction to direction. Assumption becomes a tool rather than an unconscious habit. Through consistent application, the mind accepts new assumptions as normal, and experience reorganizes itself accordingly, not through force, but through alignment. The idea that inner state precedes outer results is one of the most consistent patterns observable in human behavior and learning. External circumstances may appear to shape a person's emotions and thoughts, but closer examination reveals that it is the internal state, composed of attitudes, assumptions, emotional patterns, and self-concept, that determines how circumstances are interpreted and responded to. This internal orientation acts as the primary cause, while external results follow as effects. An inner state can be understood as the emotional and mental environment a person habitually occupies. It includes expectations about outcomes, beliefs about self-worth, and assumptions about what is possible. This state is not formed overnight. It develops through repeated experiences and interpretations. Once established, it becomes familiar, and the mind naturally seeks to maintain what feels familiar, even if it is limiting. From an educational standpoint, learning begins internally before it is demonstrated externally. A student must first accept the possibility of understanding before comprehension can occur. If the inner state is one of resistance or fear, learning becomes difficult regardless of the quality of instruction. Similarly, in life, progress is limited not by resources or opportunity alone, but by the internal readiness to receive and utilize them. The inner state influences attention. What a person notices, ignores, or focuses on is directly related to their emotional and mental position. Someone operating from an inner state of confidence notices opportunities A, ND solutions, while someone operating from insecurity notices threats and obstacles. The external environment may remain unchanged, but the experienced reality differs significantly. Emotion is a key indicator of inner state. Persistent emotions such as anxiety, calmness, frustration, or optimism reveal the underlying mental orientation. These emotions are not random reactions to events. They are expressions of internal expectations. When an individual changes their inner state, emotional responses shift naturally, even in similar external conditions. Behavior flows from inner state rather than from conscious intention alone. A person may intend to act confidently, but if their inner state is dominated by doubt, their actions will reflect hesitation. Conversely, when the inner state is aligned with assurance, confident behavior emerges effortlessly. This demonstrates why forcing external behavior without addressing internal alignment often leads to inconsistency or burnout. Inner state also determines persistence. Challenges are inevitable in any meaningful pursuit. The difference between those who continue and those who stop lies largely in their internal orientation. When the inner state is rooted in purpose and belief, obstacles are seen as temporary. When the inner state is rooted in uncertainty, obstacles are perceived as confirmation of failure. Educational psychology highlights the concept of self-efficacy, the belief in one's ability to influence outcomes. Self-efficacy is an inner state, and it has been shown to predict performance more accurately than skill level alone. This reinforces the principle that internal orientation sets the stage for external achievement. The inner state shapes decision-making. Choices are not made in isolation. They arise from internal beliefs about risk, worth, and possibility. When a person believes they deserve success, they make decisions that support long-term growth. When they believe success is out of reach, they make short-term choices that reinforce limitation. These decisions accumulate over time, producing visible results. One of the most misunderstood aspects of inner state is that it does not require perfect positivity. It requires stability. An inner state aligned with a desired outcome is characterized by calm expectation rather than emotional intensity. This stability allows consistent action without constant emotional fluctuation. Emotional extremes often indicate internal conflict rather than alignment. Changing the inner state requires awareness and repetition. The mind resists abrupt change but adapts to consistent exposure. Small shifts in self-talk, expectation, and emotional response gradually alter the internal environment. As the inner state changes, behavior and perception adjust naturally, creating a chain reaction that leads to different outcomes. The relationship between inner state and external feedback is cyclical. External events often mirror internal expectations, reinforcing them. This cycle can maintain both success and struggle. Breaking an undesired cycle requires interrupting it at the internal level rather than attempting to control external variables alone. Inner state also affects how feedback is interpreted. Constructive criticism can be received as guidance or as an attack depending on internal orientation. When the inner state is secure, feedback is useful. When it is insecure, feedback is threatening. This difference influences growth and learning. Time plays a role in this process. Inner state changes often precede visible results by a period of adjustment. During this time, consistency is essential. Doubt often arises when external confirmation is delayed. Understanding that internal alignment must stabilize before results appear helps maintain discipline and patience. The inner state is teachable. It can be trained through conscious attention, reflection, and practice. This transforms personal development from a matter of chance into a matter of skill. When individuals learn to regulate their inner state, they gain greater control over their responses and experiences. The principle that change begins internally shifts responsibility from circumstance to consciousness. This is not about blame, but empowerment. When a person understands that inner orientation influences outer experience, they gain the ability to initiate change regardless of current conditions. Outer results are the visible expressions of internal patterns. When the internal environment is aligned with clarity, confidence, and expectation, external circumstances reorganize to reflect that alignment. This process is gradual, natural, and consistent. By focusing on the inner state first, individuals create a foundation upon which sustainable external change can occur. Faith, when approached educationally, is not blind belief or passive waiting. It is an active discipline that is developed through consistent practice. Faith grows the same way any skill or capacity grows, through repetition, application, and experience. The fourth keynote emphasizes that faith is not something a person suddenly acquires. It is something that is trained by acting before evidence appears. In most areas of learning, action precedes proof. A student practices a concept long before mastering it. A musician plays incorrect notes before developing accuracy. In each case, progress would be impossible if action were postponed until certainty was guaranteed. Faith operates on the same principle. Acting without physical evidence is not irrational, it is a requirement for growth. The mind is conditioned to rely heavily on sensory confirmation. It trusts what it can see, touch, and measure. However, many of the most powerful human qualities, confidence, courage, creativity, and commitment, develop before any external validation. Faith is the internal decision to move forward while the outcome is still uncertain. This decision trains the mind to operate independently of immediate feedback. From a psychological perspective, repeated action in the absence of immediate results strengthens belief. Each time an individual chooses to act from a chosen assumption, rather than from doubt, they reinforce an internal narrative of capability and trust. Over time, this narrative becomes the dominant perspective through which situations are interpreted. Faith through practice requires consistency rather than intensity. Occasional bursts of belief followed by long periods of doubt do little to change internal patterns. What reshapes the mind is steady, repeated alignment with a chosen direction. Small actions taken regularly build more trust than dramatic actions taken inconsistently. Educational research shows that learners who persist despite uncertainty develop deeper understanding. They tolerate ambiguity and remain engaged even when progress is not immediately visible. This tolerance is a form of faith. It is the willingness to continue participating in a process without constant reassurance. In life, this same tolerance allows individuals to remain steady during periods when outcomes are still forming. Acting without evidence also reshapes emotional regulation. When a person waits for proof before acting, emotions become reactive and dependent on external events. When a person acts first, emotions gradually stabilize. Confidence begins to arise from internal commitment rather than from circumstances. This emotional independence is one of the most valuable outcomes of practiced faith. It is important to distinguish faith from wishful thinking. Wishful thinking. King remains passive, waiting for conditions to change. Faith expressed through practice is active and engaged. It involves showing up, preparing, and responding as if the desired outcome is possible, even when uncertainty remains. Action is what separates faith from fantasy. Practice-based faith also develops resilience. When an individual continues to act despite setbacks, they learn that disappointment does not equal failure. Each experience becomes data rather than judgment. This perspective reduces fear and increases adaptability. Over time, the individual trusts their ability to respond effectively, regardless of outcome. The process of acting without evidence trains the nervous system. Initially, uncertainty may trigger discomfort or anxiety. With repetition, the nervous system adapts. What once felt risky begins to feel normal. This physiological adaptation supports mental stability and reduces stress responses during uncertainty. Faith through practice also shifts focus from outcome obsession to process engagement. When attention is placed solely on results, frustration increases during delays. When attention is placed on consistent action, satisfaction increases regardless of timing. This shift improves persistence and overall well-being. Language plays a reinforcing role in this process. Internal dialogue that supports continued action despite uncertainty strengthens faith. Statements that emphasize learning, growth, and participation help the mind remain engaged. Over time, this language becomes habitual, supporting automatic alignment with purposeful action. Faith is not tested when conditions are favorable. It is developed precisely when conditions are unclear. Each moment of uncertainty is an opportunity to practice trust. By responding consistently rather than reactively, individuals deepen their internal stability. As practice continues, external confirmation eventually appears. When it does, it reinforces faith rather than creating it. The individual recognizes that belief preceded evidence, not the other way around. This recognition further strengthens confidence in their internal guidance. Faith through practice ultimately transforms the relationship with uncertainty. Uncertainty is no longer a barrier but a training ground. It becomes a space where inner strength is exercised and expanded. This transformation changes how challenges are approached across all areas of life. In educational terms, this keynote teaches self-reliance. It shifts dependence away from constant reassurance and toward internal commitment. By repeatedly acting without immediate proof, individuals learn that progress is not dependent on perfect conditions, but on consistent participation. Through disciplined practice, faith evolves from a concept into a lived experience. It becomes the quiet confidence that action taken today will contribute to outcomes tomorrow, even when those outcomes cannot yet be seen. This form of faith is not fragile. It is built through repetition, experience, and trust in the process itself. Consistency over time is one of the most underestimated yet powerful principles in human development. While many focus on sudden breakthroughs or dramatic moments of change, lasting transformation is almost always the result of repeated small actions sustained over an extended period. The fifth keynote emphasizes that belief is not formed in a single moment of inspiration, but through continual reinforcement. What is repeated becomes familiar, and what is familiar becomes accepted as true. From an educational perspective, learning is cumulative. A student does not master a subject by studying once, but by engaging with the material repeatedly until understanding stabilizes. Each repetition strengthens neural pathways, making recall and application easier. In the same way, beliefs are constructed through repeated mental and emotional experiences. One confident thought does not create confidence, but consistent confident thinking over time does. The mind naturally resists change because it seeks efficiency and predictability. Existing beliefs, even limiting ones, require less energy to maintain than new patterns. Consistency is what overcomes this resistance. Repeated exposure to a new idea gradually reduces its unfamiliarity. What once felt unnatural begins to feel normal, and what feels normal becomes believable. Repetition works not through force, but through accumulation. Each small act of alignment contributes incrementally to belief formation. Individually, these acts may seem insignificant, but collectively they reshape internal patterns. This is why short, consistent practices are more effective than intense, sporadic efforts. The mind responds better to steady signals than to extremes. Time plays a critical role in this process. Belief needs time to settle. Just as physical strength develops through repeated exercise over weeks and months, mental alignment develops through sustained practice. Impatience often interrupts this process. When individuals abandon repetition too early, they mistakenly conclude that change is impossible, when in reality it was incomplete. Consistency also stabilizes emotion. Emotional states fluctuate, but repeated alignment anchors the individual during fluctuations. On days when motivation is low, established routines carry momentum forward. This reduces dependence on mood and increases reliability of action. Over time, discipline replaces effort. From a behavioral standpoint, repeated action rewires habits. Habits operate automatically, reducing the need for conscious decision-making. When beliefs are reinforced through habitual action, alignment becomes effortless. This automation is a key indicator that belief has been integrated rather than merely adopted intellectually. Consistency also strengthens self-trust. Each time an individual follows through on a commitment, they reinforce an internal sense of reliability. This trust accumulates gradually. When self-trust is strong, doubt has less influence. The individual no longer needs constant reassurance because consistency has demonstrated capability over time. In educational psychology, spaced repetition is known to produce deeper retention than massed practice. This principle applies equally to belief formation. Repeated exposure over time allows the mind to process, integrate, and accept new ideas without overload. This gradual integration prevents resistance and fatigue. Consistency does not require perfection. Interruptions and setbacks are part of the process. What matters is returning to alignment rather than abandoning it. Each return strengthens resilience and reinforces the underlying commitment. This approach prevents all or nothing thinking, which often undermines progress. Repetition also shapes identity. Identity is not defined by isolated actions, but by patterns. What a person consistently does, thinks, and feels becomes how they define themselves. Over time, consistent alignment with a desired state transforms identity from aspiration into reality. The individual no longer tries to believe, they simply do. Consistency over time also changes expectations. Initially, outcomes may feel uncertain. As consistent practice continues, expectation shifts from hope to anticipation. The mind begins to expect alignment to produce results even before they appear. This expectation further reinforces belief, creating a positive feedback loop. One of the challenges with consistency is delayed feedback. Results often appear after belief has stabilized, not during it. Formation. Understanding this delay is essential to maintaining commitment. When individuals recognize that repetition is working beneath the surface, they are less likely to abandon the process prematurely. Consistency teaches patience, which is itself a form of belief. Patience reflects trust in gradual progress. Without patience, repetition feels burdensome. With patience, repetition feels purposeful. This mindset reduces stress and increases sustainability. Language and self-talk play a reinforcing role in consistency. Repeated affirming language supports the mind during periods when results are not yet visible. Over time, this language becomes internalized, supporting automatic alignment with consistent action. Consistency also reduces internal conflict. When actions align regularly with intentions, inner tension decreases. The individual experiences coherence rather than contradiction. This coherence is emotionally stabilizing and reinforces continued alignment. Over extended periods, consistent repetition produces compounding effects. Small improvements accumulate, producing noticeable change. This compounding is often invisible in the early stages, which is why many underestimate its power. However, once momentum builds, progress accelerates naturally. Consistency over time transforms belief from a concept into a lived reality. It shifts focus from momentary effort to sustained participation. Through repetition, the mind learns what to accept as true. Through time, that acceptance becomes identity. This is why consistency is not merely a strategy, but a foundational principle for lasting change. Alignment of thoughts, feelings, and actions is the final and integrating principle that brings all previous ideas into practical coherence. When these three dimensions operate in harmony, internal conflict diminishes and purposeful movement becomes natural. Most struggle does not come from lack of desire or ability, but from misalignment, thinking one thing, feeling another, and acting in a way that contradicts both. This internal fragmentation weakens momentum and creates confusion. Thoughts represent direction. They frame how situations are interpreted and what outcomes are expected. Feelings represent acceptance. They indicate whether an idea has been internalized or resisted. Actions represent expression. They demonstrate what is actually believed at a functional level. When all three align, they reinforce each other, creating a stable internal state that naturally produces consistent results. From an educational perspective, effective learning requires coherence. A student who understands a concept intellectually but feels anxious about applying it will hesitate. A student who feels confident but lacks understanding will act inconsistently. True competence emerges when understanding, confidence, and practice develop together. This same structure applies to personal development and life outcomes. Misalignment often originates in unconscious conditioning. A person may think positively but feel unworthy due to past experiences. They may act confidently in public but privately doubt themselves. These contradictions create internal tension. The mind expends energy managing conflict instead of progressing forward. Alignment reduces this energy drain. Feelings are often the most overlooked element of alignment. Many attempt to change thoughts and behaviors without addressing emotional patterns. However, feelings signal what the mind truly accepts. If thoughts say one thing but feelings contradict them, behavior will eventually follow feelings. This is why emotional awareness is essential for lasting change. Alignment begins internally. Thoughts are adjusted first by choosing interpretations that support growth rather than limitatio. Feelings are addressed by allowing new emotional responses to become familiar through repetition. Actions then follow naturally, not as forced behavior but as expressions of internal agreement. Consistency plays a key role here. Alignment does not require constant emotional intensity. It requires stability. When thoughts, feelings, and actions consistently point in the same direction, momentum builds. Occasional doubt does not break alignment, sustained contradiction does. Returning to alignment after disruption strengthens resilience. Alignment also simplifies decision-making. When internal components agree, choices become clearer. There is less hesitation and less need for external validation. The individual trusts their responses because they arise from coherence rather than confusion. From a behavioral standpoint, aligned action feels easier. Resistance decreases because actions no longer contradict internal beliefs. This ease is often mistaken for lack of effort, but it is actually the result of reduced internal friction. When alignment is present, effort becomes efficient. Alignment also affects how external feedback is received. Praise and criticism are processed without destabilizing identity. Because internal coherence is strong, external input is evaluated rather than absorbed automatically. This supports emotional balance and continued growth. Time strengthens alignment. Repeated alignment reinforces internal consistency, making it the default state. Over time, misalignment becomes uncomfortable and the individual naturally returns to coherence. This reversal indicates integration rather than temporary discipline. Alignment influences identity. Identity is not defined by isolated thoughts or actions, but by consistent patterns. When thoughts, feelings, and actions align over time, identity shifts. The individual no longer attempts to act a certain way.
Simply are that way.
One of the most important outcomes of alignment is integrity. Integrity here does not mean moral perfection, but internal honesty. Actions reflect beliefs, and beliefs are emotionally accepted. This honesty reduces stress and increases self-respect. Alignment also supports adaptability. When internal coherence is present, change does not feel threatening. The individual can adjust strategies without questioning their worth or direction. This flexibility is essential in dynamic environments. Misalignment often produces self-sabotage. When internal parts disagree, progress triggers discomfort, leading to withdrawal or avoidance. Alignment resolves this by ensuring that progress feels safe rather than threatening. The mind no longer resists its own goals. Alignment represents mastery. Knowledge, confidence, and application operate together. This integration marks the transition from learning to competence. In life, it marks the transition from desire to experience. Alignment of thoughts, feelings, and actions creates a state of internal order. In this state, effort is purposeful, emotion is stable, and action is consistent. Results are not forced. They emerge naturally from coherence. When internal elements move together, external experience follows the same direction, reflecting the harmony within. The essence of this entire speech comes down to understanding that transformation is an inside-out process governed by awareness, practice, and alignment. Nothing meaningful is created by chance. Every result begins as an inner assumption, is strengthened through repeated focus, and is brought into experience through consistent action. When the mind is educated to operate deliberately rather than habitually, life shifts from reaction to intention. Acting as if is not a technique to escape reality, but a method to train consciousness. By choosing assumptions carefully, cultivating an inner state that matches the desired outcome, and practicing faith before evidence appears, an individual learns to lead rather than follow circumstances. Consistency over time turns these inner choices into stable beliefs, and alignment of thoughts, feelings, and actions ensures that effort is no longer divided or conflicted. The true power of this approach lies in responsibility. When one recognizes that experience reflects inner orientation, waiting is replaced by participation. Progress no longer depends on perfect conditions, but on internal coherence. What once felt distant begins to feel inevitable, not because it is forced, but because it is prepared for internally. The speech teaches that fulfillment is not something to be chased, but something to be embodied. When inner discipline becomes habitual and alignment becomes natural, results follow as a consequence, not a struggle. This is how intentional living is developed, quietly, consistently, and from within.